Greetings. Today we're going to look at Karthik's law of inflation and how we are seeing a lot of social pathologies manifest themselves, and some frightening facts about how the economics of the media have incentivized the perpetuation of pessimism, and people in both political parties have become pessimistic and nihilistic, when in fact the primary purpose of this channel is to discuss the future and examine the reality of what is happening as far as trajectories of megatrends go, and how most things are in fact getting better. Not all things, but most things about human society and the economy are getting better. Conservatism in the US has really collapsed as an ideology and as a political faction, and this applies to both the Republican Party as a formal entity as well as people who consider themselves conservatives. Because in the 80s and 90s, they were much more about optimism and the free market system and generally finding pragmatic solutions for human upliftment, and now they have become a victim mentality, nihilistic, pessimistic, self-pitying group of people for the most part. I can prove that through what they say about the inflation narrative alone, and this is going to be a multi-part video series. So we begin with Karthik's law of inflation. To study this in more detail, you can refer to this video up here in the upper right hand corner. But this law is simply that the longer any internet discussion about any topic continues, the probability of someone making a comment about inflation being a much greater crisis in modern society than it is approaches 100%. Furthermore, this mention will usually emerge before Godwin's law is fulfilled. And we look at the 8 different ways in which people try and push an inflation narrative that is completely contrary to any measurable empirical facts. Go to that video about Karthik's law of inflation to look at all 8 of these in detail. But US conservatives and libertarians are entirely enmeshed in all 8 of these, and they have utterly lost their minds on the topic of inflation because they strongly oppose all measured empirical evidence, and they're desperate to outdo each other in terms of how outlandish of an anecdote they can claim. And this ranges across all 8 of these tactics. Presenting anecdotes as evidence of inflation is often the opening move. Once you probe them further, you get into situations like where they say how humanity was more prosperous 20, 50, 100, or even 200 years ago. Or categorizing all wealth creation as inflation. The stock market's too high, that is inflation, and therefore that's bad. Therefore it would be good if the stock market crashed. But wouldn't a lot of people lose their jobs? Yes, but that would be good because then there would be less inflation. We would have deflation, which is good. That is how they think. And I will demonstrate how it is not simply a case of having the wrong information, but it is absolutely a case of being unmoored from any capacity for logical thought or any interest in the facts. Instead, what they do is selectively seek evidence so that what they already believe can look true. And they do that over all conservative and libertarian media at this point. So let's go to some examples. Here's an article from PJ Media. There are hundreds of such articles. Here's one that is particularly over the top. PJ Media is a Republican and libertarian-leaning website. This is written by Stephen Green. Biden's inflation is crushing the middle class, no matter what stupid lies he tells. Okay. The middle class is certainly being underserved in the United States, but what is the real reason? Inflation is coming down, Joe Biden insisted, so they want to reject this out of hand. Now, as I've proven in all of my monthly inflation updates, inflation is in fact collapsing and is definitely going down in the second derivative. But we can look at points a lot more simple than that, because we see here, at least I'm not in the market for a new car. Something most Americans used to look forward to. Fortune says last week that new cars are now toys for the rich as the average price of a new vehicle has jumped to almost $50,000. That's not a negative. That means that more people are able to afford what used to be luxury brands, BMW, Lexus, Mercedes, and so forth. The accurate method of looking at inflation would be to compare the same model's price over time. Honda Civic of 10 or 20 years ago versus Honda Civic of today. Honda Accord of a long time ago versus Honda Accord of today. Ford Taurus of a long time ago versus Ford Taurus today. Ford F-150 truck of a long time ago versus today. That would be the way to look at it. As we can see from this chart from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, new cars have been flat for almost all of the 21st century, flat in price, and a recent 24% bump has occurred, mainly due to supply chain, but that means it is going to reverse very quickly and actually be in deflation for a bit once the supply chain bottleneck gets resolved. Again, I can tell you for a fact that a Honda CR-V or a Ford Taurus, if you look at the 2000 price versus the price today, it's barely 1% a year, maybe 1.5% a year of a price increase, despite the massive gains in electronic features and so forth in those cars. So to say that cars have experienced hyperinflation and that the average new car that people can buy costs $50,000, implying that a Honda Civic or a Toyota Corolla or a Toyota Camry now costs $50,000 is very dishonest. But articles like this are way past the point where they actually care about facts. Now this brings up the question about whether is this what Stephen Green, the author, actually believes, or he just knows that he's catering to a very unintelligent, low IQ audience and he's trying to feed them the garbage that will sell. It's hard to tell what he actually believes, and that's not even very important. Maybe he knows better and he's just selling outrage to people who he wants to have click on his article so he makes money, or maybe this is what he truly believes. But there is an audience who want to be told things like this and therefore whine about inflation, and he is definitely giving a certain audience what they want, which is why I say conservatives and libertarians have lost their minds on the subject of inflation. That's up 30% since just 2019. But as we saw, it was 24% rise since the beginning of the century, since 2000. So it's up 24% since 2000, yet he cherry picks a data point since 2019, just that blip that we saw. Worse, rising interest rates, a harsh necessity to tame inflation, false, as any longtime viewer of this channel knows, has caused monthly payments to rise even faster. The average monthly loan payment for a used car is up to $544. As a young lad of 19 way back when, so the 1970s given his age, I once spent $700 on a good enough used car, if barely, not $700 monthly total. So wait, wasn't this article about bashing the Biden administration? The Biden administration has been in office for only 2 years and 5 months. Now he's flipped back to how much the price of something rose since the 1970s. And he doesn't mention whether salaries rose since the 1970s. Of course, if he mentioned that, then he would see that the ability of people to purchase a used car has in fact risen. It has not fallen. He's trying to go back to the 1970s and say, hey, a used car used to cost $700 then and now it's $700 per month and therefore that is bad. No mention about salaries, about the rise in the stock market, or the price of electronics back when he was a young lad of 19 in the 1970s versus the price of the same electronics today. He would never mention something like that. But now he wants to talk about a 50-year window of time rather than just the 2 years and 5 months, less than 2.5 years of the Biden administration, which was the main point of this article. So he's really throwing the kitchen sink at this thing to get people outraged about inflation. But to call his methodology unscientific is very charitable. This is just throwing anything at the wall to outrage very low information, low IQ people, which is what conservatives have trained themselves into being at this point if they actually believe something like this. There's a silver lining to Biden's dark cloud of inflation. If you're a car manufacturer, that is, car sales might be down 8% since 2021, but profits are going nowhere but up. So wait, conservatives are against corporate profits rising. Remember how I point out that conservatism always converges to the leftism of a short while prior? Conservatives are now against profits going up, especially for U.S. automakers. Ford's gross profit rose 4.4% in 2022 from a year earlier. Well, 4.4% isn't that much. I thought he said inflation was very, very high. While GM's adjusted earnings grew by about $200 million to reach $14.5 billion. Wait, $200 million to reach $14.5 billion, meaning $14.3 billion to $14.5 billion, is only 1.5%. Notice how he stops talking about percentages when he is trying to hide that the percentage is not a large increase. GM's earnings only rose 1.5%, and Ford's earnings only rose 4.4%, and you're saying that this is bad, and you're a conservative, and therefore are becoming a leftist of a few years ago by saying corporate profits are bad now? Notice how anything can be packaged into bad news when you have decided that your entire political ideology is based on victim mentality, pessimism, and nihilism. Tesla made an annual profit of $2.6 billion in 2022, with revenues up 51% over 2021. Again, why is that bad? So revenues grew a lot. Now all revenue growth is inflation. Tesla made a lot of money because they are selling a product that is very technologically disruptive and a lot of people worldwide want it. The United States is not the only country in the world. That is also one of the various things that these U.S. conservatives seem to imply or seem to subconsciously insinuate when they talk about inflation. Remember, U.S. conservatism is very against all electric cars, as I've pointed out in this video over here, simply because electric cars represent technological disruption. They're correct that the government should not mandate a certain type of car, the free market should decide it, but that's not even the argument they're making anymore. They're saying that electric cars are bad simply because you can't drive 450 miles in a given day, as if you're going to do that every day. See that video if you're interested in that subject. But we continue with Stephen Green's weirdness. Must be nice. Ooh, corporate profits are a bad thing. That's what conservatism has become. 2023 conservatives are further to the left than even the Bill Clinton administration of the 1990s, let alone having anything in common with the Reagan administration of the 1980s. Do you want to fill her up too? Gas prices are primed to rise in a few weeks. And while gasoline prices have been edging upwards in the United States because of more taxes layered onto them, oil prices are lower than they were 15 years ago. Oil crossed $100 a barrel in 2007. They were again $100 a barrel in 2011. Now they are $70 a barrel. It is down by 30% 12 years later. That is deflation. And they will never mention that, nor will they say that U.S. fracking is a good thing. Oh, you thought U.S. conservatives are in favor of domestic oil production like fracking because that reduced U.S. dependency on foreign oil. Drill, baby, drill, they used to say. Well, that was eons ago. Conservatism has changed a lot from the days of drill, baby, drill. Now they are desperate to claim that gasoline prices have risen a lot. They're not interested in saying that fracking, the best thing to happen to the U.S. economy in the last 15 years, made oil prices worldwide go down and erased the United States' dependence on foreign oil. The United States went from importing a huge amount of foreign oil, including from the Middle East, to importing no foreign oil. You would think U.S. conservatives would be happy about that, but that's not what conservatism is. Remember, they have no fixed position. They only keep drifting leftward. So we continue with Stephen Green. Not only are eggs more expensive than the most expensive gallon of regular in the country, what does one have to do with the other? Remember, conservatives have a weird obsession with the price of eggs, which you can see in this video up here where I go into that in more detail, but I'll also go into more detail about that in subsequent chapters of this video series. It's more than the price for a pound of ground beef. Wait, so why should ground beef be more expensive than a dozen eggs? And now that the price of a dozen eggs is more than a pound of ground beef, that's somehow a negative. What do the two have to do with each other? One could take this sentence and turn it into a positive. Hey, the price of ground beef has fallen to below the price of a dozen eggs. But no, remember, conservatism has become about selling pessimism, just like leftism became that way before it. But conservatives were supposed to be the guardians of optimism, and now they are quite the opposite of that. This is again portrayed as a negative. The price of a dozen eggs is now more than the price of a pound of ground beef, and that's bad, rather than say, well, ground beef is now cheaper. That's the first time eggs have eclipsed ground beef since BLS started tracking those prices more than 40 years ago. Again, why is that significant in any way that the price of one thing suddenly surpassed the price of another thing? And somehow that's bad rather than the price of the thing that is now the cheaper of the two being lower as being good news. In states like Colorado, where Democrats have passed strict laws regulating how chickens are kept, prices are even higher. Now, for those who don't know, pasture-raised eggs are much more nutritionally valuable than those produced by a factory farm structure. Those factory farm eggs are disgusting and in very, very cruel conditions and should not even exist in the marketplace. It is good that U.S. society is migrating away from those. You're paying a little bit more for those eggs that are pasture-raised, but again, the absolute price is very low. How much of your annual income is spent on eggs, even when egg prices were high, and they've already collapsed back down since the last 3 months when conservatives were losing their minds over the fact that the price of eggs was a little bit higher. Home price inflation continues, albeit more slowly before. Prices rose only 7.7% annually. Wait, aren't conservatives the ones who get giddy talking about how much home equity they have gained? If your home price went up, that means you gained home equity. Yes, that's bad for people who are yet to buy their first home, but that's fantastic for anyone who already has a mortgaged home. You cannot separate those two. If the price of something rose, that is good for the people who bought it before the rise. That is bad for the people who bought it after the rise. That will never change, and his ability to spin this into a negative is crazy. I'm sure that Stephen Green, someone of his age who lives in Colorado, definitely owns a home, He is absolutely ecstatic about the home equity he has, but he will certainly attribute that to his brilliance as an investor rather than to inflation. So when talking about how brilliant he is because he made home equity, he will not attribute that to the same inflation that he's whining about and how home prices rising is a bad thing for the purpose of his article where he's selling pessimism and fear. That was again one of the points in Karthik's law of inflation. The same person whining about inflation will simultaneously attribute his home equity gains as not inflation derived, but rather being the product of his own brilliance as an investor. You can't make this up. So back to Stephen Green. That's Joe Biden's inflation tax making us all poorer, even though he used anecdotes from 50 years ago. Just trying to buy the same food, cars, and houses we could buy before his spending orgy began. The left is winning its war on the American middle class through attrition. That's the one truthful thing he said. The left is winning its war on destroying the middle class in the United States simply because conservatives, instead of fighting back against leftism, end up agreeing with the leftism of a short while ago and therefore are the anvil to the leftist hammer. Leftism would not have succeeded as much as it did if clueless conservatives, who are the most politically unskilled faction in any major country within the last half century, were not actively aiding the leftists that they pretend to be opposing, but they're secretly going to agree with after sheepishly surrendering to them because conservatives have been gaslit into seeing their own surrender and defeat as the normal course of affairs and the natural order. So this was part 1 of this video series. Now we'll go on to part 2 of how conservatives and libertarians in the US have utterly lost their minds on the topic of inflation.